was bound to be a difficult journey, certainly. Only now it seems like the end of exile. Not going back, but a feeling of exile ending. For the distance is measured, and that is what matters. By measuring the distance, we come home.
He wasn't well and had been resting, and he seemed to get rather worse the night before he died, and it had been discovered that he had an enlarged aorta and that his life was at risk, that at any moment he could die. But it happened very suddenly the following morning. He didn't suffer, but it was a shock.
It was an Anglican service, which I must confess surprised me. And the hymns, well, there was a poem by Herbert, you know, from the area, one of his favourites. There was Jerusalem, but what struck me was the utterly orthodox nature of the service. I presume, I suppose that anybody on the left will be a free thinker, but I suspect it's because it was a kind of local piety that he was buried there in this Anglican church, in this Anglican community under the Black Mountain, and he was totally committed to it.
I think it's very difficult to sum Raymond Williams up because he was so many things at so many different times, and sometimes all of those things together, thinker, critic, political figure. I just prefer the simple word writer. I think he'd have preferred it himself. And what I mean by that is that he managed to give voice to his people. I don't just mean they're the Welsh people, but those who would have come from the kinds of hopes that he would have come from.
He was always, in his life, still a marginal character. He lived on the margins. He lived in border country the whole of his life. He came from border country. But what he did, unlike some others, was to bring that border right to bear on the heart of the establishment. And that took quite a lot of courage.
He stared into the centre of each bush, looking for the familiar detail of twig and light. Every feature seemed not itself, but the deepening shadow of the disappearance of darkness. The same shapes, the patches of shadow. It was only in knowing the country he could see this far, the branches, the stones, the roof tiles, the great cleft of the watercourse. It would lie ordinary and quiet, the mist of light out of sleep. Growing outlines of shadow in a world as yet without detail, without colour. He felt a certain awe, a certain coldness. What he saw in this country which he believed he knew was very deeply unfamiliar. A waiting strangeness, as if it was not yet known what world would come out of these shadows.
What's this about a strike then, Harry?
General strike, Jack, to stand by the miners. We take no duty from tomorrow morning.
Oh, aye. You a miner then, Harry?
It isn't that, Jack. It's the principle.
Principal? Some bloody principal taking my pay packet and throwing it on some bloody mine?
It'll work out, man. If we let them go, they let us go. There'll be our own wages next.
Yeah, it's a bloody war that done it. You all come back wanting to square up to someone. Where are you, boss? I'll knock you down.
Aye, that may be.
You can't make you live in with your fists, man. And I'll tell you another thing now. They'll beat you. First round knockout.
It'll work out, man. Anyhow, we're stopping tomorrow.
My grandfather, who is in fact the hero of border country, Harry Price, was a most remarkable man. He'd been given a white feather during the war by a woman who wondered why he wasn't in uniform. This was in the Great War. He had joined up then and he'd been gassed. And I think this rather shortened his life. And although my father had tried to write this book about his own childhood and parents for a long time, it had gone through several drafts. And really it only took its final shape after his father died, which I think may have been the effects of the gas.
Damn good mind to clear out. I'm sick of blasted school and swatting, the whole outfit. I could clear out now and get myself a job.
Better not do anything in haste, Will.
If anything's worth doing, it's worth doing straight out. Well, shall I leave school and get a job? I'm asking you a question, Dad.
Well, you might at least answer him, Dad.
He'll answer himself.
What does that mean? Nothing.
All right, you set yourself a job, you finish it. Agreed, the job may be wrong, you might have done better. They get the habit when it's difficult of stopping and going off somewhere else. It's not the job that's useless, it's you yourself. Nobody sets himself what he doesn't want. What you set yourself, you wanted, or you seem to want it. Only once turn aside from what you set yourself, once hold back a bit of your strength. Whatever happens, succeeding or whatever it is, whatever the others say, still it doesn't matter how you end. You're finished with yourself. So go on. I can say it. Choose for yourself.
I'll try, Dad.
Have I sold out? Is that what you really think?
It's the questions you learned not to ask. The questions I was taught not to ask.
In general, that can't be true. This place exists to ask questions and try to answer them.
Oh, in theory.
And in practice. Look at the work being done.
Ask anyone seeing it from the outside. They get the feel.
Yes, as prejudice.
Ask any of your own students, then. Ask them the reality of it.
You're telling me?
Yes. To me, just that kind of genial tolerance. That last turn of the screw. You're here, you're established. You don't have to argue. So you can be so bloody polite you kill people.
Really? Actually, I wouldn't have thought I was that important.
Oh, no, you're not. But you rule England as servant and master. It's time and over time you have fought.
This is very flattering, if still quite untrue.
Oh, yes. Say that. It's all you can say. And all you need to say. You've got this manner that's the ultimate weapon. It makes the rest of us feel so wrong and ridiculous we simply throw our strengths away. We give up our causes and our voices to become just like you. And then you congratulate us. And what sounds like England tells us we're right. I tell you the opposite. I tell you you're wrong. I tell you England must be won back from you, urgently and completely.
Well, we both became communists very young and stuck to it right through the war and out the other end. And then he was in the Normandy campaign, so was I. He was driving chunks, I was supposed to blow them up.
It was a very traumatic experience for Raymond. He had just started Cambridge at that time, done a year or two, and then he went off, as so many did, to be a soldier, and saw a lot of frontline action and absolutely hated it. And I think that gave him a hatred of war and a desire to fight against war, which really stayed with him all his life and was one of the most powerful motives for his political actions afterwards.
It was the courage of ordinary soldiers that struck him, and the grotesque inefficiency of the British establishment which struck him most there, and I think probably strengthened his commitment to a European way of looking at things.
Raymond was a communist in the sense he was an anti-fascist against unemployment, against appeasement. But then when he went back to finish his university degree, he left the Communist Party. So he left very early and became very isolated as a result. He refused the Cold War at its very inception, and I think there are probably no other really political individuals who kept going, who weren't crushed by that refusal. Many tried to refuse it, but they actually were just crushed by that experience. That's to say, he didn't accept American anti-communism or the American way of life, and he refused to accept Stalinism and the easy answers of communist orthodoxy, and he sought for if you like, a way through that, using any resource that he could.
He had this problem of adjusting to a new view of communism and Marxism, doing adult education classes and beginning his academic career. And so far as I can see, in a very real sense, he withdrew into academicism, and even his study of Marxisms and other isms seems to me then to have been academic, as mine was, though he always had this link with adult education. And it's really the old new left, as it were, that he comes back into action. And I remember I used to argue with him once, because one of my books was described as a classic new left book, and I blew up, you see, because I said I wasn't new left, I wasn't old new left, or new left, or even instant new left. I was not even old left, I was antediluvian left, you see. And he said, well, I'm coming back to that slowly.
It's very interesting that people write now about the way in which in his early days he was a Stalinist. Well, in a way, what he did was he blew that blanket notion. That's a very middle-class way of looking at things. To call somebody a Stalinist because they belong to the Communist Party in Wales doesn't mean, of course, that they sanctioned and were in favour of millions of murders and imprisonments and gulags in the Soviet Union and so on.
He didn't become hostile to the Communist Party, but it was quite clear that, knowing him somewhat later, that he rejected a lot of the conspiratorial, if you like, or Leninist politics of the Communist Party, whereby small numbers of people meet in closed rooms, as it were, and then, through their organisational skills, are then able to dominate large movements, which, of course, is a typical traditional form of left-wing organisation, where small numbers effectively control a nominally democratic movement because they're better organised. And so it's just like managers control a big private company through their control of information, so do small left-wing groups.
There's no doubt that he put the study of, in the title of his first and perhaps still most famous book, Culture and Society, he put the study of culture and society in Britain onto a different plane. Sometimes in that writing now there's a mustiness, perhaps a touch of the study, but he came into an interdisciplinary mode of argument that other people really weren't developing in the 50s and 60s. And he also very effectively began to dispute the notion that you could separate the history of aesthetics or art, literature, or wherever it is, from the history of a society.
It was in 1960, we'd only just moved from Hastings to Oxford, where my father was working with the Workers' Educational Association, and we just moved into our house and painted it and everything, when quite unexpectedly one morning this letter came asking him to become a lecturer at Cambridge University. We were all extremely surprised, and we children didn't want to move, of course, but I think even then I could see it was an offer you couldn't refuse, because Cambridge University, you know, that was incredible. There was some hostility. He didn't tell us at the time. He rather shielded us from this. But there was a man who published an attack on him in the Cambridge Review.
It's worth quoting. It's extraordinary. As part of a group of English radicals, lapsed Stalinists, academic socialists and intellectual Trotskyites, he has, with others from the extramural boards, the community centres and I haven't made this up, certain northern universities, found in the slogans a common culture and democratic participation, causes to be revolutionary about. I mean, that's by a very distinguished Cambridge historian. To sneer at in public, in that kind of tone, a young lecturer turning up in Cambridge, I still find fantastic. I mean, what it indicates is how afraid of him, in a way, they were.
It was really as if, oppressed by an enemy, a people had conceived its own liberation as training its sons for the enemy's service. And they would even boast how well they were doing, how much the enemy thought of them. The point of this, always, was the polite pretense that no enemy existed. Naturally, the enemy said so themselves. They were just normal people doing what needed to be done. But also his own people said this. The fact of oppression was always softened and rationalized. It was easier that way to survive.
Williams offended people, clearly, straightforwardly because of Marxism. He offended people because they were dismissing Marxism increasingly as an outmoded or a mechanistic doctrine. He never did. I think he also offended people because they began to see him as rather clodhopping in some of his attitudes towards literature and society. Now, we can all draw different morals from this. Mine is that he was ahead of his time, not behind it. I think that he was leaving them in his wake, and that he will undoubtedly be seen as the major figure. I mean, it's silly to say he's like George Orwell, but he's more like George Orwell as a creative, intellectual figure in British life than any tuppenny halfpenny bunch of Oxford and Cambridge dons, even if some of them are living in Switzerland.
I never found that he was a man who was greatly disliked. One was on the whole more conscious of his admirers, and indeed I think one of the interesting things about Williams is that he has influenced a set of people who in some ways you could say were really rather livelier intellectually than he was. I mean, I don't think liveliness is a quality I'd particularly associate with him. Seriousness, high seriousness, earnestness, conscientiousness, intellectual conscientiousness. But it's interesting that he did influence was followed by a number of young men who were certainly extremely brilliant intellectually. And it's very significant that he did.
He was important and disturbing as a teacher of literature because he continually insisted that literature was part of society. It wasn't something set apart. That's what his early books were about, that literature is not something set apart from society. It is part of society, it's part of the social process, it's part of the social struggle. And that was what was exciting to us as undergraduates, to hear somebody talking about Dickens or George Eliot or T.S. Eliot or George Orwell, as if this was part of a story about a general political and social struggle, and, with the passion which he felt about that struggle.
It seems to me that he was fulfilling something which was perhaps demanded by the Arnoldian and Leavisite tradition, which is that the understanding of literature in aesthetic or moral terms needs to be completed by some interest in social conditions. That was not only implicit in Leavis, he actually wrote about the relation between literature and society.
Where he was so different, I think, from Leavis was that he believed that potentially the media, film, television, newspapers, were capable of development in a democratic direction, that they gave much more opportunities, really, for democracy than the old purely book culture. And therefore, whereas before him, the sort of tendency of Leavis' influence was, how can we inoculate our children so that they don't take any notice of this terrible culture? Raymond was all the time thinking, how could people have more control over the media? What was wrong was not the media, but the way they were controlled.
What he took from Leavis was a very strong sense of cultural crisis, of the ways that people interested in literature and culture had something to say and something to contribute to the debates about society as a whole. But in Leavis, it seems to me, in his later life, that was always very pessimistic. I mean, Leavis had more or less given up hope for any kind of cultural revival. He had a very pessimistic view of the way modern civilization was going. And Raymond, right through his life, and that's why he was so exciting to people like me as a student, just refused that.
He said somewhere, without this kind of lived connection, all our cultural studies are ice cold. And I agree with that, and it was this warmth, this sense of the lived connection with ordinary people and of their creative capacity, given the knowledge and understanding, that really animated his whole working life.
Look, Robert, what I'm asking from you, I can't get from anyone. I'm asking for the connection between work and living. I'm asking you to live in my work, and you can't. You're scared. You're scared of meeting anyone. You're scared, really, of being anyone.
And you?
Yes, of course.
Then at least you can respect the difficulty, Peter.
Well, of course I can respect it. I could even respect defeat, but what I cannot respect is surrender. Did you really have to change your whole voice, your whole body, every last bit of you?
I don't think this is true. Well, in part, yes. In externals.
When I look at you, I know in a way that I'm looking at the enemy, Robert, the respected enemy.
But I don't feel it like that at all. But you see what you're doing. You're taking me as a parent and rejecting me. Always, Peter, you're looking unconsciously for another family, and you must ask yourself why. I don't mind being baited. But you must see what you're doing. This is simple displacement. And while you're caught in that, you'll never understand your real situation.
This is my real situation. What I'm trying to say to you is a kind of truth. The connections are much deeper than we ever suspected, between work and living, between families, between cities. Now, you surrendered by breaking those connections. We shall hold on to them and ride our history.
You know, the one thing that irked him was that, in a way, all of that talent was frequently not dissipated, but it was used up to a great extent in teaching the next generation of rulers of Britain. You know, they would go from Cambridge down to the City of London or into government, into the civil service, and take over the top jobs. And Raymond had taught them, you know, this man who was the fount of so much criticism, social criticism and revolutionary analysis of British society. There he was, teaching the rulers of Britain.
I used to tell my students, until I thought perhaps they knew it for themselves, that this is a very golden offer. Like most golden offers, you have to discriminate in it. You are being offered here something which is intellectually very important, and this is mainly why I've stayed, that the contestation that I'm interested in happens in places like this. I mean, essentially here you are meeting your key opposition, and you can argue against it. If you're slackened from that by the comfort, the tradition, the artificial beauty of the place, then you have to keep withdrawing. So I find I'm always into Cambridge and out of it, into and out of it. It's the only way I can live with it. As I've gone on being here, I can see that if anywhere has accumulated the amount of capital this has, it has so many beautiful things. I mean, very little of it is natural. I mean, this is the result of wealth being put in generation after generation in fine buildings, fine gardens, and so on. And I always have a double feeling about that, like I do when I'm looking at castles in Wales. You know, I can see they're beautiful castles. I also remember what they were put there for.
It was the whole career he was now questioning. Of course, his mother had wanted this work for him. His father, too, had wanted it. Not only his immediate family, but in a more general way, all his own people had wanted this for him. It was the ordinary image of a better life. The education had dwindled to an end in itself, but was still given a quite mystical approval. People would rather see their own sons separated, going away from them into the rituals of another kind of life, than probe at all deeply into their own lives, where the important changes must come.
I don't think he thought in classic Leninist terms of being a moment where power was transferred, or even that he had a very simple model of an alternative society. I think basically he was an egalitarian and a democrat, that he was very hostile to the existing system because of its inequalities and its lack of democracy. And I think that a lot of his political energies went into building movements which would involve as many people as possible to change this state of affairs without necessarily a very clear idea of where it was all going to end.
And it's very much like something that Gramsci was getting at, I think, a revolution in which thousands and thousands of people, by taking part in changes in their own lives, help to change the world by actively, democratically joining in.
If you take the title of his famous political book, The Long Revolution, most people who talk about things taking a long time in some way or other are capitulating to the status quo. And most people talk about revolution are talking about something which happened in 5 years or which is inspiring or our lifetime. And he really tried to fuse those two things. He was seriously for a revolution, and he was serious about how long that would take.
Stand the idea of the Wilson-Callahan government supporting American troops in Vietnam, which of course they were actively doing. And he became generally disillusioned, I think, with Labour politics at that time. And it was from that, of course, the new movement began, what's usually called the New Left, which he was a very prominent leader of, the so-called Mayday manifesto of 1968, which was an attempt to regroup the socialist left outside the Labour Party.
The importance of our relationship with the United States at this particular time is a secondary issue. We have a majority of 3. We have essential legislation to push through with important domestic consequences.
You talk about a majority of 3 votes. Well, that's just the point. Left MPs could put tremendous pressure on the government just because their votes are so crucial.
You just want to sit there and see the communists take over.
And what you can't see is that this alliance with the US over Vietnam is deciding the basic political character of the Labour government.
Look, it's a question of priorities. It's a question of keeping this show on the road, here at home, here in this place to start.
What is wrong with the Vietnam War? It's not just that it is pitiless and brutal. It is a war consciously fought by the Americans as part of an international struggle.
Oh, that's just rhetoric!
No!
Rubbish!
He was in the New Left with Edward Thompson and the others. They were displaced by this new bunch who were terribly theoretical, Europe-oriented. Edward Thompson wouldn't have anything to do with them, but Raymond did go on working with them, which took courage, since he wasn't a member of their generation. He had all those battles in Cambridge where they seemed to have acutely disliked his ideas, if not him. It took courage to come out and speak up for popular culture, for Welshness, for Welsh Europeanism in the UK of that day and in the Cambridge of that day.
The thing about the left response to Raymond, this critical left response, was that they reflected this kind of retreat that he never made. He always insisted that you don't withdraw into the parties. I think that's why he left the Communist Party. You don't withdraw into easy isms. He never produced political followers. There isn't a kind of Raymond Williams followers. Very important fact. Many readers, but no believers.
Williams mapped the terrain, and then other people took up their own little areas of that, did work there. He had a quite astonishing ability to see the development of political history as a kind of whole. He had a kind of detachment about him. He could stand back and he could look at the longer term trends and currents And those of us who perhaps were more immediately engaged in certain struggles or certain issues then learnt enormously from him.
Raymond was always upsetting the great, the holy cows of the left, you know. He was always upsetting them because he could do so many things, I suspect, you know. He was a dramatist, he was a novelist, he was a philosopher, and he was a teacher, of course. And they could never pigeonhole him, you know. So they used to patronise him. Especially the great intellectual left would patronise him, or those who consider themselves to be intellectual. They always considered him something less than being a proper philosopher of the left, because in a way he was doing so many things. He had this kind of great myriad talent, this sort of Renaissance man, you know.
People often complain that Raymond's work is very difficult, as if he was writing just for a very small readership. And I think that comes from the idea that if you can't read something immediately, like a headline, then it's really elitist. And that's a sort of English reverse snobbery.
For a man who committed himself to communication, who wrote endlessly on communication, I must say that I find half his books incomprehensible. Utterly incomprehensible. The prose is the most dense and clotted I've ever tried to read, at times. This was partly, I think, because he always placed great stress on complexity, that all human affairs were complex. And you can see it at its clearest, or should I say at its unclearest, in his book Marxism and Literature. I defy anybody to read that without going round the bend.
Raymond wanted to get his argument across quite seriously to as many people as possible. Take key words as another example of the way in which he took on the power structure, he took on the language, and in key words he examined words like community or power or authority, and he tried to show where they had come from, who had made them, how they had been used, what role they had came to play. And so like a dictionary, he was trying to make available to people the words in which they relate to each other.
But take your friend the reporter. Why did he publish what so clearly was off the record and private?
If I knew the answer to that.
But you do know the answer. That he opposes these bases, and for good reason, the lives of thousands of people. So what he did was reasonable, deliberately to delay and embarrass a bad piece of policy.
Just the same, this business will ruin me. And it won't alter the policy, not in the slightest degree. Instead of an argument, you'll have a scandal. And for that, in the short view, you and that reporter are responsible.
And in the long view?
Oh, yes, I know. It will appear I ruined myself.
What they call ruin. But it's not like that. You'll be stronger for this in the long run, when the dust has settled. The details don't matter, but the choice will matter. People will only remember that you were against the bases.
No, Alan, they'll remember the scandal. Some odd business, wasn't there, about Walter Dix?
Yes, about the bases. The old men were for it, he was against it.
Alan, you don't understand the politicians. When the change of policy comes, as it will come, the old men will be in the front of the stage. And the few who made trouble before it was time will still be unreliable.
And the record of history?
Before the history can be written, they'll have to get rid of us. Forget we were people and just look at what happened. That's why the present always seems so muddled and pointless beside the order and shape of the past. And so God help the man who thinks he's living in history with none of the doubts, the mistakes, or just day-to-day tiredness which really make our decisions.
Raymond was in the nuclear disarmament movement from the very beginning, and in later years became very concerned not only about stopping nuclear weapons, but of stopping the whole pollution of the environment when it wasn't at all a popular thing yet. But I'm sure he would have been absolutely against the idea that the Labour Party had to go along with nuclear arms and nuclear weapons just because other people had them. I think he would have regarded that probably as a great betrayal.
I remember he and I used to run a little socialist discussion group in the senior part of the university called the Tawny Group. And I remember one of the first meetings we had of the Tawny Group, when we revived it, Raymond said, I want to talk about ecology. Now, at that time on the left, that was regarded as a little bit sort of on the fringe, you know, with the kind of muesli belt stuff, you know, a little bit eccentric. And I said to Raymond, are you really sure you want to talk about it? He said, yes, what we need is to rethink, you know, socialists need to rethink their attitude to the environment. Well, now, if you look at the record, I mean, he's one of the first people to produce pamphlets on socialism and the environment, the need for a new kind of alliance between the green and red, as it were. Very active in various organisations promoting that kind of dialogue. I think he'll be seen historically as a key figure in that issue, as in many others.
The Fight for Manod is a novel that I think very interestingly begins to reflect upon the changing shapes not only of his own border country, but the way in which multinational capital is coming in, and there is again this debate between a more abstract denunciation of these outside forces and a feeling that you can in fact only deal with them sort of on the ground.
Matthew walked on into the village, feeling himself already altered so soon after coming back. But the village had altered too, and he saw this more clearly walking. On this narrow road, a slightly widened lane, which the lorries treated as just an odd mile or two on the long haul to the north, there was no separate place to walk, hardly anywhere even to stand, and the few road improvements only added stretches of speed. The houses seemed now to stand in relation to the road, rather than to each other. It was no longer an enclosed village, but a place on the way to somewhere else, as almost everywhere in Britain was coming to be. Many of the trees under which the farms and groups of houses had sheltered were felled, and the walls seemed more open and more naked. The hedges along the road had been clipped short, and in some places replaced by stretches of wire and concrete fence.
A year ago, when I came back here to Whitehall, I'd have said that the idea of the new city of Manod was dead, stone dead. Now, what the local people still want is small local developments, improving but not altering the kinds of place they've got used to. But then even for that, they need money. And to get the money means having to fit in with what other people want, which is planned dispersal on a big enough scale to make the investment economic. My advice so far has been very simple, that we should turn it back from paper to the human issue it began as. And what I'm asking you to do is to come to this fresh, to make it human again.
Oh, me? Going through the files?
You must know what we're up against. The old drift, the old dirt of the Industrial Revolution, the new drift, the new indifference, brittleness of this stage of capitalism, this frantic southeast, the London-Birmingham axis, and beyond it, its counterpart, the emptying country, the men without work, the communities dying.
He's at his strongest, I think, in analysis, you know, his books on the long revolution, culture and society. Above all, I think, the country and a city, which is brilliant on the countryside, where he demolishes the myths, the pastoral myths. He's tremendous on that, and where he also speaks out for the skills of ordinary people. These people are usually dismissed as unskilled farm labourers, and he asks how many intellectuals can make a hedge, you know, how many could plough a furrow, and he brings out the multiplicity of skills needed even to keep a small mountain farm going. And he sees this primarily as the roots of culture.
In the 1984 strike, he became very politically active. And a group of us were involved in fundraising for the miners and above all for their families. And Raymond lent his name to that, spoke on public platforms and was much involved, and we raised quite a large amount of money just from Cambridge Dons, and this was a Dons fund. The students had their own activity, of course. We raised a considerable sum. But I think Raymond, in some ways, had some difficulties about that because he was extremely critical of the national leadership of the strike. He felt particularly strongly about the ballot issue, and about the timing of the strike. But it was absolutely characteristic of him that despite those reservations, he would speak whenever asked, you know, in the fundraising meetings to raise money for the support of the miners and their families.
Yes.
You're working on the facts of the strike?
Not the strike, just the general prospect of the industry. But it's the beginning of everything.
I used to think so.
But not now.
What I mean is it's all so material. The one consuming interest in all union work is money and power. They're bargaining with the employers from the employer's point of view.
Well, why do the employers keep saying that strikes are a threat to society? If it's all part of this materialism, why don't they just accept strikes?
Why not, indeed? Strikes are part of the British way of life. They're within the terms we've all come to accept. It might be a crude part of the market mechanism, that's where they belong.
They can't all be fools. The ruling class all seeing them as a threat.
They are fools. They should be glad of them. As long as it's only strikes, there's no danger to them at all. Capitalism grew first and survives today by collapsing one side of the tension.
Well, then why do they say that we shall get to a breaking point?
Nobody believes that. I mean, they say it from time to time as part of the bargaining, but nobody believes it. The compromise is built in from the beginning, and they know it. Capitalism regulates with this terrific militancy towards a compromise, which is all the unions have ever been asking for. It's a victory for them if they get 3% instead of 5%, or redundancy pay instead of no redundancy. And it will always be the same, because in fact they make no absolute demands.
What would an absolute demand be?
I don't know. I don't think anybody can know in a society like ours. I mean, when you think what we're doing tonight, hanging around the Labour Party like a gang of calculating relatives, keeping in touch with a tired old auntie, but an auntie with a legacy. Because it just might be that she'll be the unconscious instrument of something new, some new start. It hasn't got very much, but it's a good deal better than nothing.
You don't really think that.
It's only when everything above ground is withered that you go back to the roots. Necessarily, it's cold and dark.
What you saw in 84-85, which was again impressive, of course, which I think deeply impressed him, was the kind of creativity of working men and working women in a crisis that had been there in 1926. It couldn't be translated then any more than it was in 26 into a successful political strategy. I think it didn't shock him. I think it confirmed his feeling that working class politics and the nature of socialist education in this country was still a long-term process. He never despaired. Why should we?
I think that he was able to bring to bear a very original perspective on the miners' strike. There was a sense in which the strike dramatised or crystallised a lot of the issues that Williams had been writing and thinking about for a long time. He didn't just see it in economic terms, he didn't just see it in political terms, he saw it as a question of the relationship between community, work, livelihood, and culture. And in a way, the strike, therefore, was an image of what he had been thinking about. And so he was able to intervene in it very creatively, I think.
Where are they? Well, the rest of us are here. Where are they, the people who make these decisions and then announce them? As if they weren't about human beings at all, but just percentage reductions in the labour force.
They learn like that.
They come to their bits of waste ground, draw their lines in the dirt, and then they can run our lives to the limit. It's just accidents to them that there are men who will take their work and then they can lay off. They've cut themselves out from people and society altogether, and yet they control everything, the people and the society.
They do as the market tells them. And in the end, it isn't a market at all, it's this.
When I heard that on the wireless, I couldn't believe it. It was the way that they said it. You can't believe it, even if you've heard it before. No dismissals are contemplated before the Christmas season, and that bit of pretended humanity makes it all clear. They say we're getting machines that can think. We don't need them. We've got them. We must have. No man could write parts of the labour force. Wouldn't he look, while he was writing it, at his own hand? At himself. The landscape of childhood never disappears, but the waking environment is adult. The street, the committee, the long, quiet library, the file of revised manuscripts, the books shifting under the arm as you run for the crowded bus. The personal meaning is evident in every shape in this country, every sound of the loved voices, but the public meaning is elsewhere, in a different negotiation, and in another voice.
He was a person who didn't show his feelings very readily. And he didn't show his annoyance. As a young man, of course, he'd been extremely aggressive. And he learned to control it. So it's not easy to say. He didn't like having his work frustrated. He wanted to have every morning of his life almost set aside for a quiet time to work. And given that, he was really angry. He must have had a lot of social and personal resentments, but they didn't surface very readily.
He's one of the few great Welsh intellectuals, I think, of post-war years. And yet everybody inside Wales is extremely patronising. That Welsh establishment, you know, the Crachach, who run Wales, the 12 or 15 families who run all the television stations, and they run the Arts Council and the museum and all the rest of it, you know. To them, Raymond was, well, some guy who lived in Cambridge. You know, they'd never, ever understood that he was actually addressing himself to that essential problem of what constitutes Welshness in relationship to this great kind of English cultural imperialism and American cultural imperialism, even more important, that informs everything that we do now.
He once said to me, he wondered times if he'd have been a very different man, if his headmaster in Abergavenny had actually sent him to Aberystwyth, along with Alan Lewis, shall we say, rather than to Cambridge. I think there was something in him that yearned for that. I believe the yearning was because he felt that it would have been an easier life to live as well. And if he thought twice about it, then I don't doubt that he'd have chosen the harder path he took.
But I always felt there was an inner core there that he kept secret, and in which he, as it were, wrote. Now that comes out in his last posthumous book, People of the Black Mountain. And I remember him telling me shortly before he died, the book's coming on great. He said, I'm now into cattle rustling in the Bronze Age. And of course the book that has now been published ends with the Romans. And it was surprising, in one sense, from a man who talked about being in border country all the time, not quite sure what he was, whether he was Welsh or English or something distinctive, should have this tremendous a sense of roots in Black Mountains, which were clearly Welsh, and he saw the origins of the Welsh as pre-Celtic, much older than anybody else, and he wanted this brought out.
He remembered his own strangeness, but also his sense of renewal and discovery. Now, passing houses along the road, the occasional glimpse of a lighted room, a woman getting up to draw the curtains, a child alone at a piano, he wondered how deeply he had been formed by this world.